Hello, listeners. Welcome to Part 2 of the Dyatlov Pass incident, the 50th episode of the Morbid Curiosity podcast. Thank you so much for waiting for this episode. We really needed the extra time. If you haven't listened to Part 1, this episode will be harder to follow, so we recommend listening to that before this one. As I delved into this topic, I felt I got to know the people involved, and honestly, it was pretty hard at times to read some of the morbid details. I couldn't help but feel for the grieving families who still don't know what happened to their loved ones. But I want to tell the story in as much detail as possible, in hope that one day the truth of their deaths might be revealed. Just remember that these are people who died under complicated circumstances. To us, the mystery is fascinating, but to their families, that mystery is a constant reminder of someone they have lost. Please keep that loss in mind. This episode contains discussions of the deaths of young adults and the autopsies that followed. If this isn't something you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. As a reminder, much of the information on this topic has been misconstrued over the years. I can't speak or read Russian, nor do I have access to primary sources. I've done my best to present the facts as best I can with what reputable sources I could find. Without further ado, let's discuss the theories surrounding the mysterious deaths of 9 hikers on the desolate frozen slopes of Kolatsiakol in the Ural Mountains of Russia. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity podcast. The unexplained deaths of the Dyatlov expedition group have fascinated people since the incident's occurrence. With the rise in dark tourism and continuing popularity of hiking, it's not surprising that many people have traveled the difficult route and camped on the exact same spot. None have died mysteriously. So what was different the night of February 1st, 1959? As you know from Part 1, 10 students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, Russia, set out on January 23rd to hike to the summit of Otorten, a large mountain in the northern Ural Mountains. Their names were Igor Dyatlov, Ludmila Dubinina, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Krivonichenko, Zina Kolmogorova, Nikolai Thibaut Brignola, Alexander Kolevatov, Yuri Yudin, Alexander Zolotaryov, and Yuri Doroshenko. They took trains, buses, and even a sleigh as far north as they could toward the mountain. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin, suffering from health issues, had to abandon the hike, but the rest of the expedition group continued on their journey and were expected back in civilization on February 12th. That date came and went, and when no word was heard by the 20th, search parties were organized, and an official criminal case was opened by the Evdel prosecutor's office. The search teams found the remains of the expedition's tent on the 26th. On the 27th, 4 of the members of the Dyatlov expedition were found frozen to death. Another was found on March 5th, and the last 4 were found a month later on May 4th. During the search and before, strange lights were also seen in the sky above the Ural Mountains. All 9 bodies were autopsied, but the last 4 members also underwent radioactivity testing. It was found that the first 5 members of the expedition had minor injuries, but died from hypothermia. The last 4 members had extensive internal injuries, as well as higher than normal levels of radioactivity on some of their clothing. Part 1 of this episode contains the details about the hikers, the scene of the incident, as well as the autopsies, and some contextual information about the natural and social environment. The theories proposed at the time include avalanches, wind, and a physical attack by other humans, either the Mansi, the indigenous people of the area, escaped prisoners from a nearby gulag, or the KGB, the Soviet Union's intelligence agents or secret police. The lights in the sky also made people think that a rocket, missile, or meteor might have drawn the hikers out of their tent and caused their injuries. After the case files were released in 1989, more theories were proposed, and new ideas are coming out still today. Most of these theories support only part of the circumstances of the hikers' deaths. For example, the avalanche theory seems plausible until we remember that the poles of the group's tent were still standing firmly upright, and everything in the tent was in its proper place. If there had been an avalanche, the tent poles would have been torn out, or at least pushed over, and the tent buried, knocking everything inside into a jumbled mess, and this is not the case. I'll go over each theory in detail in a moment, but first I want to examine several specific things that many of the theories depend on as evidence. I want to start with an analysis of the injuries. I'll go over them here in summary before looking at them in detail. If you don't want to hear detailed descriptions of injuries, I suggest you skip this part. Dyatlov, who was one of the first to be found, had a pulmonary edema, or fluid accumulation in his lungs, either due to injury or heart failure, and a pulmonary contusion, or bruising of the lung. Krivonechenko was revealed to have bitten off a piece of his own knuckle to stay awake or stifle a cry. The piece of flesh he tore away was found in his mouth. It appeared that Dyatlov had been vomiting blood in his last moments. He had no internal injuries. Kolmogorova also had no internal injuries, but did have some bruising, which I'll go over in a moment. The cause of death for these 4 people was ruled as hypothermia. Slobodin had a fracture running alongside the sagittal suture of his skull on the left side of his head. However, the cause of his death was also ruled as hypothermia. Dubinina's nose was broken, and her 2nd through 5th ribs were broken in 2 places on her right side, and ribs 2 through 7 were broken on her left side. Some of them had punctured the right atrium of her heart, and this is what killed her. No bruising was noticed around the site of the injury, and the pathologist who did the autopsy stated that she probably only lived for 10 to 20 minutes after the impact on her chest, and she had a small amount of coagulated blood in her stomach. Her tongue and eyes were also missing. Zolotaryov's 2nd through 6th ribs were broken on his right side, some of which had detached from the sternum. This is called flail chest, and is usually accompanied by pulmonary contusion, which Zolotaryov also had. There was also hemorrhaging, or broken blood vessels resulting in bleeding, in his cardiac tissue. Kolevatov was undergoing maceration, and not much was recorded during his autopsy, except a deformed neck with no other details. Thibault sustained multiple depressed fractures to his temporal bone, with extensions of these fractures spreading to both the frontal bone and the sphenoid right at the base of the skull. Again, there was no bruising around the skin in this area. It's also very likely this injury rendered him unconscious. All members of the group sustained bruising. Krivonechenko, Kolmogorova, and Dyatlov had bruised knuckles. Dyatlov had bruises on his shins and armpits, Krivonechenko on his left hip, Dyatlov on his face, ankles, and knees, Kolmogorova on the right side of her face and on the right side of her waist. Slobodin had bruising all over his head, and Dubinina had a large bruise on her left thigh. There were also several burns sustained by the group. Krivonechenko had burned his fingers and calf. Dyatlov hair was burned, and some of the group members wore articles of clothing that showed signs of fire damage. These injuries, in a word, are unusual. I have some background in skeletal trauma and pathology, so let's talk about the fractures first. As I mentioned in part 1, it's very hard to break a 1st or 2nd rib, as they are protected by the clavicle. Considerable force is required, and today, this injury usually occurs due to vehicle collisions, and includes breaking of the clavicle. A broken clavicle wasn't mentioned in the autopsy, so it's assumed that it did not break. This is not unheard of, but it's very rare. It can sometimes occur with a sudden contraction of the muscles around the rib at the same time as traction on the arm. This creates opposite traction along the rib, which causes it to break at an anatomically weak point. This type of break can also occur while lifting a heavy weight, or even with excessive coughing, such as that seen in pertussis, or whooping cough. It was mentioned that no bruising on the skin was noted around the injury. At first, this seems impossible and mysterious, but in fact, it's not uncommon. When a bone breaks, bruising may result either directly from the force that caused the injury, or from the fracture itself and the soft tissue hemorrhage that occurs around it. Indirect force, such as that which occurs due to twisting the body, sudden muscle contractions, and compression that results in the bending of the bone, can break bones without impact on the skin at the site of the break, resulting in a break without any visible bruising. This suggests that Dubinina's injury was not the result of direct force, such as a blow, but something indirect. Zolotariev had flail chest. Significant force applied over a large part of the thorax is required to create the multiple rib fractures and cartilaginous detachment associated with flail chest. The most common cause of flail chest today is vehicle collisions. Falling can also cause this condition, but this is usually limited to elderly cases. The death rate of those suffering from flail chest varies, but the worse the trauma, the less likely they are to survive without treatment. The fact that bruises were also missing from Zolotariev's injuries also suggest an indirect force. Dubinina and Zolotariev have similar injuries, but there was a great height difference between them. This makes it unlikely that one object injured them both at the same time. Thibault's large skull fracture showed the classic signs of blunt force trauma to the head. The injured area was depressed, meaning caved inward, with radiating fractures that went all the way to the base of his skull. This type of fracture is usually caused by being struck with something large and heavy, like a hammer, a rock, or a strong kick. This type of injury puts pressure on the brain and may also cause hemorrhaging inside the skull. For the fracture to extend to the base of the skull, where the bone is thicker, a huge amount of force must have been used. A fall would not have been enough, unless it was from a great height onto a protruding rock. Slobodin's skull fracture is a little more ambiguous. Vajrajdeni, the regional forensic pathologist who conducted the autopsies, suggested this fracture was due to a blunt object, but it could also have occurred as the brain froze after death and expanded, cracking the skull. The bruising on both sides of Slobodin's head suggests it was a blow, however, possibly multiple blows that resulted in fracture, as the bruising was quite extensive. Krivanechenko's pulmonary edema, when accompanied by the pulmonary contusion, suggests that the edema was caused by trauma and not congestive heart failure. Types of trauma that could cause this include inhalation of hot or toxic gases, vehicle collisions, and high-altitude pulmonary edema. As the tent was set up at an elevation of 1,079 meters, or 3,500 feet, it's not likely to be high-altitude pulmonary edema, as this only occurs at elevations of 2,500 meters, or 8,200 feet, or more, unless the climber is vulnerable to the altitude, in which case it can occur at 1,500 meters, or 4,900 feet of elevation. Krivanechenko was young and healthy, so it's unlikely he was more vulnerable to it. As for inhalation of hot or toxic gas, if it was present, it's unlikely that only one member of the Dyatlov expedition was affected by it. Therefore, the most likely cause is massive force. At the scene of the incident, it appeared that someone had climbed the large cedar tree near where Doroshenko and Krivanechenko were found. It's possible Krivanechenko's pulmonary edema was due from a fall from this tree, but it was Doroshenko that had other injuries, suggesting he climbed the tree. Perhaps Doroshenko fell from the tree onto Krivanechenko, but it's likely that would have injured more than his lungs. The missing eyes and tongue could be due to scavengers. We know they were present in the area because Krivanechenko's nose was also missing, and a lack of coagulated blood in the nasal cavity is evidence that removal of the nose occurred after death. The running water of the stream in which Dubinina was found could also have contributed to the loss of her tongue, as running water can speed up the process of decay. Some researchers suggest Dubinina's tongue was removed before death, using the coagulated blood in her stomach as evidence. While it's true a person would swallow a lot of blood if their tongue were cut or ripped out, there wasn't enough blood in the stomach to suggest this, and she also had major chest trauma, and her ribs had punched through her heart, which resulted in internal bleeding, which could have made its way into the stomach. Kolevatov's body had the classic signs of decaying in water, such as maceration of the hands and feet, where the skin wrinkles, loosens, and then falls away. This generally begins after around a week in watery conditions, but as Kolevatov and 3 other members of the Dyatlov expedition were frozen and then thawed, this speeds up decay, so it may have been less than a week that the stream was flowing around them. As for his deformed neck, without much more information, it's impossible to say what could have caused it, or if that was what killed him. It can be said that to break the cervical vertebrae, a large amount of force is required, such as a traffic collision or a fast, hard impact, such as a blow. If the force doesn't kill on impact, the break can injure the spinal cord, causing paralysis. No alcohol or other substances were found in the group's bloodstream, although it was likely hard to test for this in the last 4 members to be found. These injuries suggest a vehicle collision, but no vehicle was present. The last vehicle the group had contact with was the sleigh they hitched a ride on to the mining camp before they even began their hike. Other possibilities include a fall from a high ledge, but the ravine where Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, and Thibault were found wasn't deep enough to have caused such injuries unless the group dove into it at a high speed, which I suppose could happen if they were running around in the dark and missed the fact that the ledge was there. I wondered if perhaps the snow den they built had collapsed on top of them, but the force necessary for snow to crush a person would not occur from a collapsing snow den. An avalanche could do it, but as I mentioned in Part 1, the area wasn't known for avalanches, the slope wasn't severe enough to cause one, and there was no other evidence that an avalanche had occurred. The position of the bodies and the footprints suggest that the expedition group lined up outside their tent before moving at a walk down to the cedar tree. They moved around the area of the fire. Someone might have climbed the cedar tree to view the tent. It's likely Dodashenko and Krivanashenko died first, or at least before Dubinina and Dyatlov, who were found wearing some of their clothing. Dodashenko and Krivanashenko appear to have been carefully and respectfully laid aside by their friends, and their clothing divided up among the survivors, or possibly used as kindling. It also appears that the group attempted to make an improvised shelter, the snow den, but didn't get too far in this process before they died. The grouping of Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, and Thibault in the ravine seems suspicious, as they were near the den but not inside it, and lying with their faces in the stream, one right next to the other, as if they were placed there. Further confusion over the position of the bodies has arisen due to the presence of livor mortis on several of the bodies. Livor mortis begins around 20 minutes to an hour after death, and is the process in which the blood, no longer under pressure from the heart, submits to gravity and pools in the tissues that are closest to the ground at the time of death. It doesn't collect in the tissue directly on the ground, as those tissues are compressed by the weight of the body, but it pools around them, leaving purplish marks that border around the parts of the corpse that do touch the ground. It has been reported that the pattern of livor mortis on 3 of the expedition members, Zolotaryov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, does not match the position their bodies were found in by the search team. This suggests they were moved after death. Since the order of death is also uncertain, it could have been another member of the group, or someone else who happened upon the scene after the hikers were dead. It's not known in what order the members of the expedition died. Several of them wore watches that stopped, likely due to the cold, and if using the watches as an indicator of time of death, Dyatlov, whose watch stopped at 5:31, died earlier. Thibault, whose 2 watches stopped at 8:15 and 8:39, and Slobodin, whose watch stopped at 8:45, died later. Of course, their watches could have stopped at any time during the hike, so this method isn't very reliable. All we know for sure is that Krivanashenko and Dadashenko likely died first, as other members of the expedition group were wearing their clothing. The reportedly dark brown skin of all the hikers could be due to sunburn. Their bodies did lay out for days before being covered over with snow. It's also possible they were partially mummified, thanks to the altitude, the dry air, and the cold. This skin coloration was not noted in the autopsy reports. There is also some question as to whether the tent was actually cut from the inside or not. Modern criminal expert Natalia Shakrova said that the examination of the tent was not very in-depth at the time. The damage was described selectively, and there are no detailed examinations of both the inside and outside of the tent, as it wasn't set back up to examine properly. The microscopic analysis could have had the fabric inside out by accident, giving a false indication that the tent was cut from the inside. The next thing I want to analyze are the lights that were reported in the sky above the mountains. The search party reported the lights on March 31st, and another UPI expedition group that was in the area witnessed similar lights on February 17th. The descriptions said that they appeared to be balls of light that seemed to move with purpose. A star of light would then appear in the center, detach from the ball of light, and fall towards Earth. It's not known if these lights were seen over Kholat Syakhl on the night of the incident, but as they were reported multiple times, they bear closer analysis. Georgi Atmanaki, a UPI student who was part of the search party, stated that the light had moved from northeast to southwest and left a white tracer in the sky like a comet. The star began to fall and he thought it would explode, but after a minute, it disappeared. The people of Evedale reported orbs of light on March 17th, and some also reported feeling some type of shockwave afterwards. This description reminded me of an incident that occurred more recently, on February 15th of 2013, when a meteor fell over Chelyabinsk, a town in Russia that's around 785 kilometers, or 487 miles away from Vizhay, the last town the Dyatlov group stopped in before their hike. The meteor moved from southeast to northwest. The light from the meteor was brighter than the sun and was visible up to 100 kilometers or 62 miles away. When it exploded in an airburst over Chelyabinsk, a hot cloud of dust, gas, and fragmentary meteorites, as well as a shock wave that was strong enough to blow out glass windows and damage some buildings, occurred. It also gave off a burst of infrasound that was picked up by monitoring stations that are designed to detect nuclear detonation as far away as Antarctica, and the infrasound waves traveled across the globe, reverberating for almost a whole day. I'll talk about infrasound more later. Other researchers also noticed this and wondered if there was a meteor shower that occurred in both cases. One that had a yearly orbit, like the Perseid meteor shower, which occurs every year around August and can be seen in the northern hemisphere. In June of 1949, there was a meteor shower in the same area, the Kunashak meteor shower, but I was unable to find further evidence of a yearly orbit or any sort of recurring orbit for an asteroid or meteor shower to connect these events. Either way, it's unlikely a meteor exploding in the atmosphere would have killed the Dyatlov group, though it could have drawn them out of their tent. The lights have also been thought to be due to covert missile launches, rockets, fuel testing, and even nuclear tests done by the Soviet government, but I'll get into these theories in a moment. The autopsies of Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, and Thibault included tests for radioactivity. All of their clothing did show trace amounts of radioactivity, as did the hikers' organs. The radioactive substance was potassium-40, and it's the largest source of natural radioactivity in animals, including humans. However, the brown sweater that had belonged to Krivanashenko but was worn by Dubinina was found to emit double the standard safety level of radiation, as did Zolotaryov's sweater and trousers, but only at the cuffs. This level of contamination exceeded the standards for people who worked with radioactive substances. As these items had been sitting in running water, it's likely they had been more radioactive before being washed with the water. This level of radiation was not likely to come from a natural source. The day before these results came through, Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator for the case, was forced to close it by his superiors. Therefore, the reports were never made public and were placed in the case file and archived in the prosecutor's office, not to be seen until the 1980s. The students lying in the stream could have absorbed radiation from the ground they lay on. The area could have been previously contaminated through nuclear testing that occurred that winter on the islands of Novaya Semilya, 850 miles north of the mountains. The dust created from the test could have settled over the Urals, and as the hikers in the stream were the only ones to make direct contact with the ground, it's possible this is how they absorbed the most radiation. It could also be for another reason, which I'll get into in a moment. Now that we've gone over some of the important details, let's look at the multitude of theories that attempt to explain the strange circumstances in which the members of the Dyatlov expedition group died. The avalanche theory was one of the earliest theories to be proposed. I've already stated why this theory is not supported. Some researchers have proposed a more centralized type of avalanche called a snow slab, in which a layer of snow falls on top of a layer of ice. The two layers somehow separate, and the top layer slides down the slope. The theory goes that the snow slab hit one side of the tent. The students, some of them injured, panicked, cut themselves out of their tent, and fled to the tree line for safety, where they built an improvised shelter, but ultimately died of their injuries or the cold. Several things don't support this theory. From the discussion of the injuries, we know several of the students would be in no condition to walk anywhere, and may have even been unconscious. Also, the snow on the tent was noted to resemble drifted snow, not heavy avalanche snow. Evidence of a snow slab in the form of broken pieces and visibly separated layers of snow at those breaks would have remained until May, when the snow began to thaw, but no such evidence was found. The fact that the inside of the tent was quite orderly and the poles were still standing removes a lot of support from this theory. If an avalanche or snow slab had hit, the tent would also have been hit by it. One theory suggests it was a snow slab that detached from the slope just below the tent, but still, there was no evidence of a slab. Another theory suggests that wind blew the students away from their tent and prevented them from going back to it. However, if the wind was powerful enough to blow the hikers away, it would have also blown the tent away, and that is not the case. Korotayev, the second lead investigator on the case, thought perhaps a hurricane had hit the slope, but the issue of the tent still standing also refutes this claim. Donnie Eicher, whose book Dead Mountain came out in 2013, has suggested that a wind tunnel or vortex anomaly occurred, creating infrasound, which terrified the hikers and sent them fleeing towards the woods. Infrasound is a low-frequency sound that cannot be heard by the human ear, but it can be felt by our eardrums. Because of the disconnect between vibrating eardrums and no visible cause, it has been shown to cause nausea, paranoia, and panic. This frequency can be created by heavy machinery, but also can occur naturally in very specific conditions, such as when a high wind rolls over a dome-shaped ridge and creates a vortex. Eicher suggests that the shape of Otorten itself is perfect for the creation of infrasound on a very windy day. However, Eicher estimated the wind speeds to be between 40 and 60 miles per hour on the day of the incident, when actual readings from nearby weather stations at the time show that the wind was under 12 miles per hour. On the night of January 31st, Dyatlov wrote in his diary that the wind was howling, but when the incident occurred, February 1st, he hadn't had a chance to write in his diary yet, so we only have the weather station readings to rely on. The weather stations are all over 50 miles away, however, so it's possible the winds were faster in the pass, but the raised pillar footprints suggest low wind speed on that day, and higher winds later. These footprints also suggest the group was walking away from the tent, not running. The prints show the group stood in a line, then moved down the slope as an organized group. They're evenly spaced, not too far apart, and stick together. This does not support the panic Eicher suggests would be caused by infrasound. This theory grows even more improbable when no one who has camped in the spot since has noticed the effects of infrasound. If Otorten was the perfect shape for this type of vortex to be formed, it would happen more often in that spot, and it doesn't. This brings us back to the meteor theory. Perhaps a meteor entered the Earth's atmosphere above the hikers that night, creating the lights and the infrasound that made the students think there was an avalanche. However, as soon as they left the tent, they would have seen that there was no avalanche. So again, this is not the full solution to the mystery, though it's possible it could be a part of it. Many people believe this incident was accidental or purposeful murder. Some of the UPI students who were in the search party mentioned that Dyatlov could be quite totalitarian sometimes as a leader. He also liked to test himself and his fellow hikers. One student reported that on one occasion, Dyatlov had annoyed his fellow students so much with repeated skill testing that they went on a hunger strike against him and had to return to the school. They said he took too many risks. Is there a chance that the incident was a survival skill test gone wrong? Perhaps Dyatlov decided it was a good night to test the group's survival skills, and so ordered everyone to remove their boots and walk into the woods to build a survival shelter and camp. Perhaps Doroshenko fell from the tree while checking on the tent, landing on several of his fellow students, causing their injuries and knocking himself and Thibault out. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin then went back to the tent for medical supplies, but froze on the way there. While waiting, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko also froze, and the last 4 members tried to survive in the shelter, unable to move due to injuries. This theory has many flaws, such as it being unlikely that Doroshenko fell on 5 people at once. Even if he did, the magnitude of the injuries doesn't support this theory. In addition, Dyatlov was more intelligent than to order his group out into the snow at night just to test them. In her 2015 book, Don't Go There, Svetlana Oss suggests the group was murdered by members of the Mansi or Khanty people. She believes that someone at home in the taiga who knew everything about tracking in those slopes killed the Dyatlov expedition group, or at least knew about it before the search party arrived. The Mansi and Khanty are the indigenous people of the Ural Mountains and were nomadic until they were forced to live in a single area, known as the Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug by the Soviet government. In the 1930s, the Soviet government tried to collectivize both peoples by killing tribal chiefs and shamans and forcibly sending their children to Russian-speaking boarding schools. Shrines were forbidden, as well as using the hunting signs I mentioned in Part 1. After the death of Stalin, these practices tapered off with Khrushchev, only to rise again in the 1980s, when industrialization and urbanization began to encroach on the indigenous people's territory. At the time of the incident, the Mansi were said to be generally peaceful, while the Khanty were generally more resentful. The diaries of the expedition group mention following a Mansi trail, seeing Mansi markings, and even possibly a hunter's camp. However, there were conflicting reports on whether the area the expedition was traversing was sacred or not. If it was sacred, a member of the Mansi people might have been offended or felt the need to protect that sacred space. A Mansi chum, a pyramidal structure made of branches, which is said to be a place of sacrifice or a marker of the spot where a moose was killed, was found 800 meters, about half a mile, from where the expedition group's tent was pitched. There was even a picture of this structure in the case file, taken by the search team. There's also one photograph from near the end of the group's film that shows a blurry image of a human figure stepping out from behind a tree. US suggests that the group was being followed and was able to take this picture of their pursuer. A fight may then have ensued, in which their pursuer was turned away. They then set up the tent on the slope instead of in the forest, so they could more easily see if anyone was still following them. They could have posted a lookout that night, possibly Zolotariev, who was the only one in shoes, and possibly he stood outside with a flashlight and an ice axe, keeping watch. US states that the autopsy reports show clear evidence of some kind of fight, what with the bruising on the knuckles and faces of several of the expedition group. She also points out that not all of the group's footprints were preserved, so there could have been other footprints on the slope that weren't preserved, or the Mansi, who were used to the environment, knew how to cover their tracks. The tent was slashed with a knife, and it's unsure if the cuts were made from the inside or not. Perhaps this is how the hikers were scared out of their tent. The immediate area around the tent had been covered over by drifted snow, so a fight could have occurred without leaving any evidence. Most of the group members' knives were found in the tent, but a knife was used to cut branches from the cedar for the fire. US suggests the fire had been the Mansi's camp, and they had cut the branches with their knives. When the Dyatlov group was forced out of their tent, they noticed the fire and went towards it. They tried to get it going again and failed. While they were out there, the Mansi either sat in the tent and cut it up to make sure the hikers would freeze, or left in another direction, covering their tracks as they went. Captain Chernyshov, a member of the military contingent of the search party, stated that if someone had approached on skis, their tracks might have been blown away. This theory seems very plausible, but there are still several issues with it. In the remote wilderness in the middle of winter, why would the attackers not take the expedition group's equipment and food supplies? If someone put in the effort to track and attack the group, why leave with nothing? Also, there would have had to have been more than one person attacking in order to push the Dyatlov expedition group out of their tent. These young people were not easily scared and had also shown their bravery in previous hikes. There were 9 of them, so there would have to be more than several people or a few heavily armed people with guns to force the group out of their tent. Also, the Mansi were known to be friendly in that area, and another group of UPI hikers who passed through the area not long after the Dyatlov group was sheltered by the Mansi. US states that the friendliness of the Mansi is one of the reasons that they weren't suspected and why they got away with murder. She states that all of the restrictions placed on their culture, all the forced collectivization, built resentment, and whoever did this was angered by another blatant show of disrespect, the Russian hikers trespassing on their sacred mountain. But again, there is some confusion as to whether Kholat Syakhl, or the pass between the mountains, was actually sacred. It's possible the Mansi hid this information from the Russian search teams, worrying it too would be taken away from them, or perhaps covering up for what some members of their people had done. US also proposes that perhaps the Mansi didn't kill the group, but found them, possibly moved them, and, not wanting any more Russians on their land, didn't report it, and then hid the fact that they didn't report it. Either way, there's not enough evidence to prove or disprove this theory. Along this same line, people have suggested that perhaps some prisoners escaped from a gulag and killed everyone. However, the nearest gulag is 100 kilometers away, or 62 miles, and none of the gulags in Ivdel had any records of prisoners escaping around that time. Even if someone had escaped the prison sometime earlier and was living out in the wild, why kill all the hikers and leave their equipment and money? As with the Mansi murder theory, if someone was surviving out there on the taiga, they would have needed all the supplies they could find. Some researchers have proposed that perhaps the Dyatlov expedition members saw something they weren't supposed to see and were killed for it by the Soviet government. Gennady Kiselov, a journalist from Yekaterinburg, is a proponent of this theory. He believes the group stumbled on some kind of secret government research or operations and were killed elsewhere. Then their bodies and belongings were moved to the slope afterwards and arranged in such a way as to purposefully confuse people. He states that some of the original testimonies conflict with one another, and as Slobodin is the only person who had an ice bed under his body, he is the only one who actually died on the slope. The diaries could also have been doctored as well to erase whatever they had seen from the record, and the labaz could have also been faked. The tent was pitched in a spot an experienced hiker like Dyatlov was unlikely to have chosen, and this suggests to Kiselov that Dyatlov didn't put it there. It's true that at the time a variety of weapons were being developed in the Soviet Union, thanks to the Cold War. Research and development of nerve gas, missiles, bombs, guns, fuel, and other weapons were funded by the Soviet government at the time. Similar things were also being developed in the US and the UK, which fed the fears of espionage on all sides. However, it's not likely a whole research facility, with the buildings and personnel that are required for such research, could be cleared away from such a remote location quickly, leaving no trace in the area. As for the ice bed only being beneath Slobodin, it's possible the ice beds under the other hikers weren't noticed. These bodies were buried for weeks and were excavated from the snow by engineering students, not crime scene investigators. It's likely that some of the details were missed. Even if the group had stumbled in on some sort of research, this is not the method the KGB would have used to eliminate threats. It was less work to shoot the hikers and return them home in sealed coffins, telling their families they had frozen to death or were contaminated by some type of poison. The KGB wanted to avoid spectacle, and the search and recovery of the students was a huge spectacle. There is also some speculation that the hikers were specially chosen to be test subjects by the government. This theory is based on the testimony of one UPI sports coach who said that no other groups could get permits to hike in that area, but the Dyatlov group had no issues. She also said that the area had been closed in late January, after the group had already left. It was officially closed for 4 years after the incident occurred. In his 2012 book, The Dyatlov Pass Incident, Alexei Rakitin suggested that the group was under KGB supervision to carry out a task, and that Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, and Krivonichenko were actually KGB agents. There is some suggestive evidence that Zolotaryov could have been a KGB agent. He graduated from the Marx-Leninism Institute and was moved around a lot during his time as a soldier in World War II, which is indicative of having special assignments. Also, why would an experienced hiking guide go with a bunch of students he had never met on such a trek? Zolotaryov wasn't buried with the other members of the group either. There are suggestions that he wasn't just a hiking guide, but a KGB escort sent to make sure none of the students fled Russia. As for Krivonichenko, Rakitin believes he was recruited by a foreign secret service agency and used the hike as a pretext to meet with foreign spies and give them samples of radioactive dust, which was hidden by impregnating several pieces of clothing with it. With that sample, the foreign agents would know what was being produced behind the Iron Curtain. The expedition could also have been a way of gathering intelligence about the area, as most of the area was considered closed by the government. The exchange would also happen in a remote location, where there was less chance of being seen. The lights could have been flares announcing the location to other agents. This technique of recruiting ordinary citizens to collect samples on clothing is an actual espionage strategy, which has been used with limited success when the US hired non-government operatives to deliver radioactive samples to them on a hat sometime before 1957. These non-government operatives are recruited from the local population and are trained to deny any government involvement. If this was the situation, something still went wrong that ended with everyone dead. Perhaps the spies were discovered by the non-spies and a fight broke out. There are still issues with this theory, however, such as the fact that it took days to get out there. That's a lot of work for a single radioactive sample, and so much would have had to be concealed that leaving the bodies on the slopes makes no sense in terms of keeping the situation clandestine. The flare, too, would have attracted attention, which is the last thing a spy wants. The KGB was present in the search group, and Svetlana Us suggests this could mean two things. Either they were searching for their agent or agents, or they were making sure that all of the students were found, alive or dead, so that they knew for sure that none of them had fled Russia with secrets. The fact that they made no real attempt to hide their presence and lost interest in the case after the last 4 bodies were found suggests the latter is more likely. If they had secret agents in the field, why draw attention to them by being part of the investigation? Years later, when a rocket launch from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the largest and first operational space launch facility located in a desert of southern Kazakhstan, was shown on television for the first time, some of the people living at the base of the northern Urals noticed similarities with the strange lights they had seen in 1959. A theory was proposed that perhaps a similar launch had taken place on February 1, 1959, and the rocket had failed to achieve orbit and fell back to Earth, scaring the Dyatlov expedition group out of their tent. However, when she asked about the launches in 1959, Svetlana Oss was told that there were no ballistic or other activities between January 25th and February 5th. Oss also contacted other government agencies, and they also said there were no launches during that time. She points out that launching a rocket that went northeast to southwest, the way the lights are said to have traveled, was not ideal, as it goes against the Earth's rotation, making it more difficult for the rocket to achieve orbit. There were 2 failed test launches of R-12 ballistic missiles from a facility around 1,200 kilometers or 746 miles away to the south on February 17th and March 31st, both dates when the strange lights were seen above the Urals. This type of missile was for medium-distance targets and later contained thermonuclear explosives. Although the Soviet government said there was no connection, they did no further tests at that facility, and the lights stopped. For these missiles to have had any effects on the Dyatlov group, the theory suggests that the group died due to the shockwave of the rocket hitting the Earth, or from chemical poisoning if it exploded over them. However, blast injuries resulting from being hit with a shockwave have a very specific pattern of trauma associated with them. These injuries occur as the organs and muscles are compressed against the bones and then expanded by the waves of pressure going over them and receding at high speeds. Only 33% of blast injuries are fractures, with the rest being pulmonary, muscular, and central nervous system related injuries. Blast injury fractures generally occur when the pressure wave bends or twists the bone until it shatters. This occurs most often in the tibia and femur, where the weight of the body as it's standing provides opposing tension. The injuries of the Dyatlov group don't match this pattern of injury. In all of these government cover-up scenarios, there are parts that intrigue, but there are also parts that are not corroborated by evidence at all. A shockwave would have left other evidence, as well as affected the tent. Despite the lack of evidence, placing blame on the military persists in Yekaterinburg to this day. Yuri Yudin himself blames the government for the deaths of his friends. The last few theories I'll briefly mention are those that are even more far-fetched. Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator of the case in its later stages, gave a very strange interview about the case after he retired and moved to Kazakhstan. In this interview, he claimed the students didn't freeze to death, and that he believed some type of unknown energy force from an unidentified flying object had been directed at Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, and Thibault. He stated that he had told the secretary of the Communist Party Committee at the time, but that they withheld this theory from Khrushchev himself, as talk of UFOs had been banned. Ivanov qualified his story, saying it wasn't aliens but a UFO, something in the sky that humans had no knowledge of, that directed the energy at only those 4 hikers, leaving them slightly radioactive. He was not allowed to state this theory in the case file, which is why he said it was a compelling unknown force that had killed the hikers. Normally, this kind of theory would be dismissed outright, but as it came from Lev Ivanov, the government official in charge of the case, and was released only after the death of other officials who had worked the case with him, I felt I needed to mention it. Some of the evidence does suggest that something was going on that night, such as the camera around Zolotaryov's neck, and the camera attached to a tripod inside the tent. There were reports of lights in the sky around the time of the incident, although it's not known if any occurred on February 1st. The last photo on Krivanashenko's camera, which was found in the tent, showed a lens flare and what appeared to be several lights in one corner over a dark background. Some people believe this is a photo of the lights in the sky, but it could also just be the last photo on a roll of film, which were often only partially exposed before winding the film back into its case. The Dyatlov expedition group's photos were all developed by Boris Bichkov, a UPI student who had known the members of the expedition group. There were around 30 photos that he had considered spoiled, either by exposing the film with the camera's lens cap still on, or taken as the search team wound the film back into its canister. These are said by some researchers to be photos of the lights in the sky. Dyatlov's camera was actually used to take photos of the group's bodies in the morgue. This is not too unusual, as the search team had to use what was available, and Dyatlov's camera still had film in it and was functioning properly. It's quite chilling, actually, as all of the photos before the morgue are of the same people, but alive and well. Other researchers believe that Ivanov was just hinting at a nuclear test that was conducted in the area, but if that were the case, the whole area would be highly radioactive, and there would be evidence of a blast site. Also, the search team observed these lights while they were in the area, and they weren't harmed by them, so it's unlikely the lights, whatever they were, comet or still classified weapons tests, injured the Dyatlov expedition members. The final hypothesis I'll mention is one with hardly any evidence to back it up, but it kept being mentioned. A faux documentary came out on the Discovery Channel in 2014 that suggested a Yeti, a folkloric snow creature, attacked the hikers. The heavier footprints in a line next to the tent and the blurry photograph of someone peeking out from behind a tree were the only evidence used to support this idea, as the rest of their supposed evidence is easily refuted by everything I've already mentioned. This documentary basically exploited the deaths of these young people for viewership, and I do not recommend watching it. I do recommend reading several books on the case if you want to know more. The books I felt contained the most information on the hikers, the scene of the incident, and the most evidence-based theories on the case were Don't Go There by Svetlana Oss and Dead Mountain by Donnie Icar. Oss's book is detail-heavy, and her research was extensive, while Icar's book presents the case in a more readable and personal manner. Icar also traveled the route of the Dyatlov expedition himself and wrote about his emotional experiences doing so. A good website with all the data laid out in an easily searchable way is dyatlovpass.com. It was put together by a web designer and hiking enthusiast, Teodora Hadziska, who was injured during a hike and suffered from flail chest, similar to Dubinina and Zolotaryov. While in recovery, she saw the 2013 horror film Dyatlov's Pass, which is based on this case, and became obsessed with the true story of the incident. She collected information, translated some of the official documents from Russian, and organized the data in a very easy-to-follow way. Dyatlovpass.com also republishes all recent articles on the case, so if you want to keep up to date, it's the best place to do so. There are 3D models of the scene of the incident, maps that show where everything and everyone were found, and many of the group's expedition diaries and photos. Several sections of the site do lean heavily on the government cover-up/KGB murder theory, but this site is otherwise an amazing resource. I also want to mention a video game that references the case. The indie game Kolat, available on Steam, recounts some of the facts of the Dyatlov Pass incident and then diverges into fiction, suggesting supernatural events and human experimentation were what killed the hikers. Some of the actual diary entries of the hikers can be read in-game, as well as fabricated military documents and accounts from the search parties. I've played this game, and I have to say it was one of the most atmospheric and creepy games I've played in a long time. The graphics are beautiful, the story intriguing, the music spine-chilling, and with the addition of the voice of Sean Bean, the game is the highest quality I've experienced from an indie game. It's definitely not an accurate representation of the case, but it didn't feel exploitative either. I might do a more in-depth review of it for Patreon in the future. Let me know if you're interested. In recent years, there have been a few new leads on the case. Early in 2018, Zolotaryov's body was exhumed and his DNA tested to confirm he was actually buried in the grave. There had been some suspicions that, if Zolotaryov was a KGB agent, after he completed his mission with the Dyatlov group, He'd killed them all and placed another body at the scene, making sure the face was in the stream so that it would decay before it was found. The bones in the grave were tested twice and compared to the DNA of his surviving niece. The first test came back negative, suggesting that it was not Zolotaryov in the grave. The second test, however, was more comprehensive and showed that it was, in fact, Zolotaryov. Also this year, in November, there was an appeal made by the Dyatlov Foundation to reopen the case. This appeal was denied. Even with all of this analysis and testing of theories, no single theory seems to explain what happened on the slopes of Kolatsiakol that night in 1959. It's likely that many things occurred at once, confusing the scene that was discovered later. It's likely the evidence for what actually happened was on the slope, but was either mishandled, lost, or hidden. We may never know what happened to the members of the Dyatlov expedition group, but that doesn't mean we won't keep trying to discover the truth. A case this mysterious continues to draw out the curiosity in us. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media and give us a rating on iTunes. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, and liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. People like Kimberly, Christy, Teresa, Allison, Caitlin, Steph, Tomorrow, Brian, Amy, Chris, and the Stray Sheep. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your own creepy stories. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. Don't forget we still have a few MCP enamel pins left, so if you want one, go to bit.ly/morbidpin to get yours before we run out. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give one-time donations by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking on the donate button. You can also help the show by going to our new Amazon wishlist at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. On the list are things that would help us improve the quality of the podcast, our workspace, and some things that are just for fun. If you prefer to write to us with a good old paper and pen, our new mailing address is now listed on our website. On our website, you'll also find links to all our social media, links to our sponsors, and other ways to contact us. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.